Greetings, Realtor colleagues from the Champaign County Association of Realtors. My name is Matt DeFanis, and on behalf of the Champaign County Association of Realtors Board of Directors, leadership team, and contract working group, it is my great honor and delight to welcome you to this session, which has been a very long time in coming. We are here today to talk about the key changes to the residential sales contract. Now, for those of you who don't know me, I'll explain why you're listening to me for the next little bit. I'm a 22-year member of CCAR. I am also a law school graduate, though not a practicing attorney, and I'm a past president of CCAR. But because of that legal education, I have found myself serving on the CCAR contract working group for about the last 20 years. And so I'm well positioned to be able to make the presentation. But please understand that everything we're here to talk about is the result of an entire team of your colleagues and peers who have worked on the realtor side of this for literally years, along with several of our local talented real estate attorneys who have also done this as volunteers. So please understand this has been a group effort and you have a lot of your colleagues to thank for this. If you hate it, it's them you have to thank for it, not me. But without further ado, let's start diving into the changes in the new version of the contract. So we're going to start with a disclaimer. The purpose of this meeting is to discuss the MLS residential sales contract, including a discussion of the rationale behind some of the provisions and best practices for its use. This is for educational purposes. The Champaign County Association of Realtors does not provide legal advice. For specific legal advice, consult your firm's own attorney and advise clients of your firm to obtain legal advice from their own attorneys. So we're going to work through this very much in the order that these changed provisions appear. So let's start with paragraph 3, earnest money release. Historically, one of the most common challenges that our designated managing brokers would deal with is being forced to hold on to earnest money long after the parties had decided to part ways, go on with life, but in the absence of a signed earnest money release and disbursement agreement by all the parties, the money just got held. So this is an important change, and I'll read it to you from paragraph 3. In the event this contract is terminated in accordance with its terms, the escrow agent shall give at least 14 days written notice to the parties of the agent's intent to release the earnest money and the terms of the intended disbursement. If there's no objection by 5 p.m. on the 14th day after the notice is given, or if all parties consent in writing prior to said time period, the escrow agent shall disburse the escrow money in a manner consistent with the terms of the intended disbursement specified in the notice or the parties' agreement. If any party objects in writing to the intended disbursement of the earnest monies, the escrow agent shall handle the earnest money in accord with paragraph 12F. So here's the key summary of changes here. There isn't going to be any more long-term holding of earnest money being held hostage just because one party is unresponsive. This still protects the party's rights. So in a sense, the release of earnest money is pre-authorized in the absence of a response, but the party's rights continue to be protected because after that notice is served, all they have to do is say they object, and it will trigger the full due process that we would normally expect. We do have a new CCAR authorization to release earnest money form. So that is new. It is important that realtors keep in mind that this form is only for the parties to specify how and to whom they are releasing the earnest money. This form does not serve as a notice of contract termination. I say that because in many cases, you'll have the parties that'll rush to sign off on that, having never actually formally terminated the contract. This form affirms the contract has been previously terminated. It is still your responsibility to make sure your clients, ideally with the assistance of their attorneys, are taking whatever appropriate steps they need to formally serve notice of contract termination in accordance with the contract. Okay, so the next of the changes, paragraph 4, possession and closing. This clarifies what the parties' rights are if it's a cash sale, because it created a little bit of a jump ball historically if one of the parties, but maybe not the other, wanted to use a title company when the other party didn't want to save a few bucks. So here's the new language. If this sale is a cash sale with no lender, the sellers and the buyers each shall have the right to elect to conduct the closing at the office of a title insurance company located within the county in which the property is located, in which case the buyers and sellers shall split equally any reasonable closing fees charged by the title insurance company as settlement agent. So the key here is either party can say, I want this done at a title insurance company. And if either party pulls the trigger to make that election, both parties agree they're going to split the cost of the title company hosting that closing. Next big change are paragraph 5A2 warranties. Now, much of this remains as it was. The really big changes are going to be with respect to inspections, but let's run through this. Written notice of breach of this warranty must be served upon sellers on or before possession, or it shall be deemed to have been waived by buyers, except that if buyers conduct any professional inspections under paragraph 5D, written notice of any breach of this warranty disclosed in the inspection reports must be served upon sellers on or before the notice deadline defined in paragraph 5D, or it shall be deemed to have been waived. So before I go on, let me talk about what that means. You can't negotiate inspection-related items and then get past the inspection contingency and then come back with 5A2 warranty claims if those items appeared in the inspection report. Now, just because an inspection covers a specific item doesn't mean that it's no longer warranted. So, for example, if the home inspection report indicates that the inspector tested the furnace and the furnace fired up and tested in normal working condition, if the furnace were not to fire up at the final walkthrough, it remains warranted. That's a new condition. Just that if the defect was already noted in any of the buyer's inspection reports, the buyer had to deal with that prior to the inspection deadlines. A lot of our changes, as you'll hear during the rest of the session, are designed to push all of the inspection-related issues from every type of inspection or test into the paragraph 5D deadlines so that both buyers and sellers know everything is done relating to inspections. There's not going to be, we've reached an agreement, oh yeah, but now another thing, or yeah, another test, or the lender says I now have to do this. So next item from 5A2, a warranted component or system shall be deemed to be in operating condition if it performs the function for which it is intended, regardless of age. Three-prong outlets not served by a ground wire need not be grounded to be in operating condition. In other words, this is designed to further limit or pare down the scope of 5A2 warranties. It's not supposed to be new. It's not supposed to be perfect. If it's performing the function for which it is intended, it is in operating condition and thereby satisfies the requirements of paragraph 5A2. So now we get into the really big changes, and that's paragraph 5D, the inspection contingency. So I'm going to read through several sections of the new verbiage, and we'll stop and talk through what that really means to you as a practitioner along the way. The buyer shall have the right to have the subject property and its improvements inspected by a licensed home inspection service, by any contractor licensed to service the specific component or components to be inspected, if such trade is licensed, or any contractor regularly servicing the specific component or components to be inspected, if such trade is not licensed, at buyer's expense. A home inspector or contractor must have advance written approval from the sellers prior to removal of any building material and/or invasive testing of building material. Buyers shall indemnify sellers and hold sellers harmless from and against any loss or damage caused by acts of negligence of buyers or any person performing such inspections. Permissible inspections contemplated in this paragraph may include, but are not limited to, the following: whole house inspections, inspections of one or more specific components of the house, including well or septic systems, inspections for radon, lead paint, asbestos, wood infestation or mold, and any inspections required by buyer's lender. Where such inspections require that test equipment be placed on the premises, sellers agree to permit reasonable access to the premises and not to tamper with test equipment. So we have a lot of changes to discuss from there. The unilateral right of termination in our outgoing contract is gone. Our 5A2 warranties remain largely intact, but with some clarifications and certain limitations. Very importantly, all All inspections are now rolled into paragraph 5D inspection timelines, and those timelines have changed. We'll talk about those. That means well, septic, and termite now have to be done within paragraph 5D. That also means for termite, that's no longer an automatic seller expense. If the buyer's lender is going to require termite, it's now going to be incumbent on the buyer's agent to ascertain that and to make sure it's getting ordered, and the buyer is going to be the one who is billed for it. The reason for that change is fewer and fewer lenders are requiring it, and in an awful lot of other markets, it is a buyer expense if it is required. In a lot of transactions, it's not. We also have qualifying deficiencies as a new term that is defined, and we'll get into that. As the term suggests, there are indeed many qualifications. This also will include lender-required inspections. Now, obviously, if you get past all the deadlines here and a lender requires it, there's going to be the financing contingency, but the intent here is all inspections are getting done on the front end of this. So that means buyer agents really need to find out if the lender is going to require a well and a septic inspection. And remember, even if the lender doesn't, that may be the best thing to do in the best interest of the buyers themselves. But find out, do the buyers or their lender require that? And if so, it has to get done during the same time frame as everything else. Invasive or destructive testing is only done with seller consent. Think of that as if the test requires scraping part of the seller's property off or digging into it or getting into the drywall, anything invasive or destructive, you got to have the seller's consent. We now have financial thresholds. So 5A2 is not subject to the thresholds. And I'll explain that for a minute. In the working group's conversations, let's say we got a sale with a $400,000 10-year-old pre-owned house. We didn't think it was reasonable to say that on a 10-year-old modern $400,000 upscale property that you no longer were entitled to have the plumbing not leaking, but if it leaked, it had to leak really bad and be $2,000 of leakage to be actionable. So in other words, if it's a 5A2 item, if it relates to plumbing, heating, electrical, those types of systems, if there's something that's leaking that's not supposed to be, or there's an electrical item that just doesn't work that is supposed to, you don't have to meet some big threshold to expect those to be fixed. So 5A2 doesn't require getting over a particular minimum threshold. However, those 5A2 items don't count toward your 5D inspection threshold. So not counting 5A2 items, which you can ask for no matter what, not counting those, you don't get to activate, swing open the gate for 5D requests unless in the aggregate, the items you're requesting exceed the greater of $500 or one half of the purchase price. So in that $400,000 example, these things have to total $2,000 or more. We on the working group wanted to calibrate this to the price of the house because we wanted to be sensitive that those buying less expensive properties aren't going to be expected to cross as high a dollar amount threshold as somebody who's buying a $400,000 or $500,000 house. So the greater of $500 or one half of 1%. The threshold doesn't count 5A2 items, but those are separate. It doesn't count wood infestation. That's separate. And it doesn't count radon. Paragraph 5D now lets the parties determine in advance how it is that elevated radon, if it tests high, is going to be handled. So we have checkboxes to indicate that the buyers are going to be paying 100% of the mitigation cost if it tests high, a box for the sellers to agree that they're paying 100% of the mitigation cost if it tests high, or an option for the buyers and sellers to split it. And we left blanks because while 50-50 split is the most common, every once in a while somebody may want to do a 60-40 or a 70-30. So we've left those blanks. It'll be up to the realtors to make sure that the two blanks total 100%. Note that post-mitigation retesting, if it's done, is going to be done at the buyer's expense. The mitigation requirement under this paragraph stipulates it'll be done far enough ahead of closing to do a follow-up test, but that's optional, and if the option is exercised, it will be at the buyer's expense. Now, the other big change here is narrowing what buyers can ask for by stipulating they have to be qualified defects. So remember, if it's not 5A2, not only must it hit a financial threshold of the greater of $500 or 0.5% of the transaction price, but items that are used to meet that threshold are qualified here. So under this new language, qualified defects under paragraph 5D are deficiencies in major components. Those major components of the premises include central heating, central air conditioning, interior plumbing systems, well systems, septic systems, electrical systems, and all mechanical systems. Additionally, it includes structural components consisting of roof, walls, ceiling, floors, foundation, and windows, but windows don't include fogged glass. It would be other types of window defects. And finally, doors. So qualifying defects have to be with respect to a major component, and it has to be one of those types of items listed. Furthermore, buyers agree that minor repairs and routine maintenance items do not constitute a qualifying deficiency. So the end result of all of this is the inspection contingency is to be used by buyers to get items that are of major concern, objectively major concern. Not major concern to that particular buyer who's really nitpicky, major concern with some major component of the house. So the next part of this we're going to talk about is changes in the inspection contingency timeframes. The notice deadline we have left as a fill in the blank. And the reason we've done that is because we all know that the difference in how many days you need to get an inspection done and get the report issued and review it and survey notice if applicable, we know that during peak season, that's going to be more days than during off-peak season. And so we've left this as a fill in the blank so the parties get to negotiate and mutually agree on here's the date by which we start this ball rolling, by when you have to have the inspection and serve any notice. Every subsequent deadline, though, is now predetermined in the verbiage of the contract. So once that paragraph 5D notice of unacceptable qualifying deficiencies is served, that triggers a 5 business day period for the seller to respond to the notice, telling the buyer either yes, we'll do that, no, we won't, or here's what we counter propose. That then is followed by 3 business days for the buyers to either agree to the seller's response or to bail out. If the buyers don't respond, the contract will automatically terminate in the absence of an agreement. I alluded to these earlier, but we have changes with respect to septic and well. Some of them I covered earlier with respect to 5A2 warranties and all inspections. So buyers have to have these done according to paragraph 5D inspection contingency deadlines. Previously, the issue here was you could get, in our outgoing contract, you could get a buyer and a seller past the inspection contingency. So the sellers negotiated a price and the sellers calculated their net proceeds. Okay, that's viable. Then we get hit up for a bunch of home inspection items. All right, we figure that out. We come to an agreement. So now the sellers figured out that cost. And then under the outgoing contract, the buyer all the way up until closing could serve a notice of 5A2 citing a septic or well issue, and the seller was simply forced to spend whatever amount of money it took to get that into normal working condition. So ultimately, our rationale in getting all of these things worked into one set of deadlines and timeframes is that we think it makes sense for both parties to have all of these items hashed out. And recognizing that well and septic issues can get very expensive. So for example, if a septic system is determined to need full-blown replacement, previously there was no upside limit for the seller. A seller could be forced to spend $7,000 on a whole new septic system when they didn't have $7,000, and the buyer could say, "Well, that's too bad. We'll sue you if you don't do it because you don't have an out." So in addition to the timeline change, we now have a cap. Now, we talked about a threshold that you had to get over for other inspection items. For these, there is a cap. If the cost to get these systems into normal working condition exceeds $3,000, then the parties can negotiate some cost splitting or they can bail out. Up to $3,000, the seller has an obligation to address it, to bring it into normal working condition. But if it's beyond $3,000, the seller can pull the safety valve and say, I can't. I got to be able to bail out of the contract. Somewhat similarly, while we have termite inspections that have been shifted to buyer expense, buyer option, which means if the lender requires it, you have to find that out early and get that done. Similarly, this has a cap above which either party can bail out. It always has, but that cap was quite low, especially by 2021 standards. And so now structural or functional damage in excess of $3,000 is what triggers the right of either party to terminate. Next up is a fairly minor change, but in paragraph 9, insurance and risk of loss, we have for years had this reference to, at buyer's request, sellers would produce a contract of sale endorsement on their insurance policy. And nobody knew what that was. I mean, we asked lawyers, we asked insurance professionals. Literally nobody even knew that if it existed, much less what it was. So that in recent years has been my personal test of whether a client is a reader. If I'm dealing with a CPA or an engineering professor, that's the one client in 100 that's going to say, hey, should I be asking for this contract of sale endorsement? Well, the answer now is not anymore. We don't know what it is. We don't think it exists. It is now gone from our contract. Next up is paragraph 13, notices. So we spent, as a working group, we spent an inordinate amount of time discussing this provision. The realtors have an understandable appetite to try to make this real world practical, not to make it unnecessarily burdensome and difficult. But at the same time, we as realtors don't want to find that we're the ones who are in the firing line if a notice does or doesn't make it to our client, or that somehow we become responsible or liable if a spam filter, especially a server-side spam filter, meaning it never made it to their inbox. They can't find it in their spam folder because the mail server never allowed it to get there. So we don't want that to put us in the line of fire. So what we ended up doing after a lot of discussion is we came up with some additional flexibility. This paragraph now allows for delivery. Previously, it was certified mail only. So that meant United States Postal Service during operating hours, lobby hours at a post office. So now you have the option for Federal Express or another reliable overnight courier service for next day delivery, providing for tracking of delivery. Or you can use USPS priority mail. And now the recipients, their realtor, or their attorney may waive these requirements. What that means in real life is if you're a buyer's agent serving a time-sensitive post-inspection notice coming up on the deadline, don't just ask the listing agent, did you get it? Did you get it with a response of yes is not the same as the seller's agent waiving the requirements of this paragraph. What you need to be looking for is some slightly more formal language. We don't have a form for this. This can be done via email. But the real key in all of this is, did the seller get it? And so a buyer's agent may ask a listing agent, can you confirm the sellers have received it? And if so, can you reply and indicate that you're okay waiving the notice requirements? If the answer comes back yes, then that buyer's agent at that point doesn't necessarily have to go to the post office or FedEx and get a receipt to be able to say, I met the requirements. If they've gotten a response and a waiver from the agent or the attorney on the other side, it relieves them of those responsibilities. Now remember, as before, if you don't get a response, either because somebody is just unresponsive or somebody might be being intentionally dodgy, you do still need to undertake one of those other methods of service to ensure that you've got proof that you served it timely and effectively. And the last item here is a relatively minor change, but in the past, in the outgoing version of our contract, and for years, there's been buried in a pre-printed paragraph an affirmation, a blanket affirmation that the sellers are not foreign persons. Guess what? We're in a very global market in the Champaign-Urbana metro area, so we do, in fact, have a lot of foreign persons. And in this particular context, foreign persons is generally somebody who's not already here paying taxes. The idea would be it's the type of foreign person who could sell the property, get the proceeds, get on a plane, and the U.S. government isn't going to get its slice if it's subject to something like capital gains. So to make sure that we now have the ability to actually say whether the seller is a foreign person or not, triggering certain requirements for withholdings, we put that at the very end. What we didn't want to do is we didn't want to have a blanket statement, because some sellers are foreign persons, so they shouldn't be signing a contract that preprints that they're not. But we also didn't want to create a complication whereby a buyer's agent and buyers write an offer, and they write the offer intending that all it needs is an acceptance. Sellers sign it as written and it's accepted. We did not want to introduce an additional step whereby the sellers have now filled out an item that constituted a change in the terms and therefore constituted a counteroffer, and therefore mandated that it go back to the buyers for yet another stage before it could be accepted. So the way you'll see this written, the sellers have a checkbox to indicate whether they are or are not, but the accompanying verbiage makes clear that that is not a substantive term that will affect offer and acceptance. So with that concludes the tour of the highlights of our contract changes. We'll be following this informational session up with opportunities for live Q&A so that we can answer your questions, with the goal being that not only will you be made aware from this session as to the changes, but a chance to really dive in deep, ask whatever questions you have before the Champaign County Association of Realtors declares formally, here is the date certain at which point this new contract is the one that's in common use and members are no longer authorized to use the old one. So thanks for hanging out with me. We hope that these changes will, on balance, be a good thing for those of us in the industry as well as for buyers and sellers. And if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me or to any of the other leaders of CCAR. Once again, thanks so much for your time and attention. It's been a pleasure working on your behalf.